It's New Year's Eve with Stu and Janine, including author Craig Shemin and his new book on the Muppets.
Now, as for our first guest tonight, he began his career at the Jim Henson Company, first in public relations and archives, and then as a writer. He is currently the president, give me an ooh. He is currently the president of the Jim Henson Legacy, a nonprofit organization that does exactly what its title implies, preserves the legacy and career of Muppets creator Jim Henson. Besides writing for Henson, his other writing credits include Clifford the Big Red Dog, Dora and Friends, and much more, including, you ready for this, an Emmy nomination for Disney's Tasty Time with Ze Franck. Ze Franck, that's French, or a lousy impersonation of it, Ze Franck. He is also the author of the Muppets Character Encyclopedia, and here is his new book, ladies and gentlemen, Sam and Friends. A whole volume that tells the entire story of how Jim Henson sort of fell into becoming a puppeteer by accident and began writing and performing that twice daily 5-minute show, which aired live on WRC-TV in Washington, D.C. from 1955 through 1961. Now, I am not a big Muppets fan. And you folks that have been following the show know that, but I gotta tell you something. I could not put this book down. I got this about a week ago. I read the whole thing in one night. It is a fascinating look at not only Henson's salad days, but a great peek into what went into producing local live television during the 1950s, including a ton of photographs. I highly recommend this book. And to prove my point, here is the author of the book to talk more about it via Skype from his soundproof booth in New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, Muppet author, historian, Mr. Craig Shemin. There he is. Yes, indeedy, do. Craig, thank you for giving up part of your New Year's Eve, and it looks like you're either going to be mailed in some kind of an egg crate or you're about to answer a question on the $64,000 question.
I feel like that.
Yeah. So let's talk about this wonderful book, and I can almost guess the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Based on your love of Jim Henson and the fact that you're the president of his legacy, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I was always fascinated by the story, and it's a story that not a lot of people know about. So I wanted to tell the story because Jane Henson never really got or wanted credit for her involvement on Sam and Friends. She always deferred the credit to Jim. She always just called herself a helper. And I had known Jane for many years, and then I sat down and did an interview with her before I knew there was going to be a book. And the more I heard her tell these stories, the more I knew how deeply involved in the creative process she was. And it wasn't just a helper. She was building some of the puppets. She performed right beside Jim for many years and even kept the show going without him when he wanted to go to Europe. So I really, I wanted to tell Jim's story, but more than that, I wanted to tell Jane's story. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, and also this story I thought was very inspiring to young artists. This guy, Jim Henson, and Jane Nebel, their classmates, they had really very little in terms of materials. And the technology was very rough. This was in an era when to create television, you had to go to a television studio and be fortunate enough to get on a television show. Mm-hmm. You couldn't just do it on your iPhone. Mm-hmm. And I thought that young artists seeing what Jim and Jane were able to accomplish in such primitive circumstances would inspire them to be able to create new material with all the technology that we have.
Okay, so that brings up the next point. Do you think anybody outside of the Henson universe would buy this? But me. Okay, I'm guilty. I'm not guilty. I mean, I'm glad that I found out about this. And also, did you think you had enough to write a book this thick? Let's start there.
Well, first of all, I hope that people outside of the Henson universe buy the book. I think there's a lot in it. If you're not a Henson fan, there's a lot in it about general television history. There's a lot in it about the music, novelty songs, especially of the late 1950s and 1960s. And even, they were doing stuff from the 20s and 30s and 40s. So if you are a fan of Dr. Demento, who I actually consulted briefly when I was researching the music on this book, I think you'll enjoy this. And to answer your second question, I wasn't sure, when I first thought of doing this book, I wasn't sure there'd be enough material, to be honest. And then Karen Falk, who runs the Jim Henson Company archives, a few years ago, they found a treasure trove of, I think, 44 or 45 reel-to-reel tapes that Jim Henson had made himself from off the air. He basically had the control room recorded, or I don't know how he did it, but it represented more than 400 episodes of the show. And between that and the scripts that survive and the handful of kinescopes and the acetate recordings and the music lists, was able to assemble enough material, because that was actually when I reached out to the Henson family and the Henson Company. That was exactly Lisa's response was, is there enough material to create a book?
So was it Karen, you said, found all this stuff quite by accident just a few years ago?
Well, they're always going through the Henson database, because Jim Henson saved an awful lot of stuff, but he didn't necessarily keep the best records in terms of storage. So we were always finding things. And I think it was just going through all of the database entries and the boxes. Karen and Carla, who works for Karen, Carla Della Vedova, Carla found this box that had all of the stuff in it. I think that it may have been just labeled as early tapes or something. That's one of the things that we found in the database, is that there were boxes that, sometimes were just labeled early kinescopes or early tapes or early films. And it's not until you get in there and open up the box that you find what's in it.
Yeah, it's astounding what's in there and what you've come up with, a complete episode guide. The fact that he had everything reel-to-reel tape recorded while they were doing them live was obviously the biggest factor in doing this, because there you had practically every single episode as opposed to kinescoping. And the reason that very few kinescopes survive is because it was a local show, for one thing, and to kinescope twice a day runs into super duper big bucks, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Especially when they went to color in the late 50s. That's even more so. Okay, so let's get my viewers familiar with you and why you love this material so much. Let's just give me a thumbnail of when it all began for you with the Henson organizations. How did you get in there? What were your early jobs? And how did you advance to becoming a full-fledged writer for them?
Well, I started in 1987, back in the last century, and I started as an intern. And I was going to Northwestern University, and I was in my dorm and watching a documentary called Henson's Place that was on public television in the 80s. And it was a 1-hour documentary about Jim Henson and his team. And I started thinking, well, gee, I'm looking for a summer internship, and I had always been a Muppet fan. The Muppet Show came out when I was about 10 years old, and I was really in the first class of Sesame Street in 1969. I was 3. So I had always been a fan, and when I was watching this documentary, I said, looking for an internship. I will call up Henson Associates, which is what it was called then, the next day, and I called up Information, as we did back then in the 80s. And I got the number in New York, and I called them and made an appointment to come in to interview for an internship over my spring break. And I did that, and they brought me in as an intern in the public relations department. And then it was a wonderful experience. And on the last few days, Jane Henson had heard that I was really interested in the Muppets, and I knew a lot, and I had worked a little bit on editing the company chronology, which was this line-by-line history of the company that Jim had started in a blank book, and then it had been put into the computer, that we had in 1987, and I had some work editing it. And Jane had heard about that, so she invited me to meet with her, and she gave me some great advice. And then she said, "Well, I don't have the authority to hire you, but I certainly hope that when you're graduating, that you'll be able to come back to us." And that's what happened. I ended up being hired in the public relations department, but also put in charge of handling the archives, because there was not a full-time archivist at that point.
Wow. And then that, how did that lead to you writing? I think your first writing assignment for them was, did I read this correctly, that you wrote press releases as if the characters were being interviewed themselves? Have I got that right?
Yeah. I was doing all sorts of press releases, and then, we would do the character interviews. We would have journalists send in a list of questions, and I would write interviews back, and then we would have the performers often, look at it. So if I was doing a Miss Piggy interview, it would get sent to Frank, and Frank would do notes on it and send it back, and then we'd edit it accordingly. But that was really, my first character writing. But at the same time, the publishing department gave me an opportunity to write some stories for them. And, they knew that I wanted to write. And at that time, for a while, I also wanted to puppeteer. I did very little puppeteering, but I participated in some of the workshops that they did. Mm-hmm. But I did not have a true talent and flair for that. So I stuck to writing, and Jerry Jewell became a mentor. And I started working a little bit with him when I was in the public relations department. But
let's make it clear that Jerry Jewell is not the same Jerry Jewell that's been on this show, who's the female comedian with CP. This is a different. This is a male.
Juhl.
Yes, spelled totally differently. And Frank Oz, who got his start with the Henson organization after Sam and Friends had gone off the air. If we have time, we'll jump into that today, too. But right now, I'm going to superimpose the 3 websites underneath right now that you can get more information about Craig and more information on the Muppets themselves. Let's see. We've got, what are they now? They are, what's yours? The book is, the book itself is samandfriendsbook.com, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I also have craigshemin.com.
Right. And the legacy?
JimHensonLegacy.org.
Okay. Now, before we jump into the history of Jim Henson and his puppeteering, you didn't know Jim Henson all that well, but you did have a lifelong friendship with Jane. So tell me about meeting Jim and if he was aware of you and how far that went, and then tell me a little bit about your relationship with Jane.
I actually met Jim during my internship. At the company softball game. It was, I think, July of 1987. I had started in June, and Jim had been in England doing The Storyteller, I believe. So he came back, and he, I think it was the first day or so back, and we had a company softball game in Central Park. And Jim knew everybody in the company. And he didn't recognize who I was. So he actually came up and started a conversation with me because we were watching the game, and they had this very funny umpire. And I knew who he was. And I'm like, oh, well, that guy is great. And Jim was like, oh, yeah, he was at our game last year. Were you in our game last year? And I'm like, no, I just came. I'm an intern. I heard we had an intern, and I'm Jim Henson. And I'm like, I know who you are, But he actually borrowed my glove for the game. We would pass it back and forth because he didn't have one. And at the end of the day, I had him autograph the glove, and I had Frank Oz autograph it. So I probably have the only game-used Jim Henson baseball glove. And it's a Hank Aaron model glove. So it's has the printed autograph of Hank Aaron, but the actual autographs of Jim Henson.
Oh my! I hope they haven't faded over all these years.
No, it's it was with a pilot pen, not a Sharpie. That some of the Sharpies fade a little bit.
Tell me
so
about
far,
it. Every
out.
picture I had Lucille Ball autographed to me is all faded. There's one you can barely see her and Gail's signature, and I'm just sick about it, Craig.
I know. I have a Gene Rayburn autograph that is faded. So and the picture fades too. So it looks like, I call it the Shroud of Rayburn. It looks a little like the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah. I know. We should mention Craig is a big game show fan, right? Give us a little bit background. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't ask. How about Jane? How did you become friends with her, and why did that last? Duh. I'm trying to move things along, and I forgot to. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it was. I started getting to know Jane when I was an intern, and when I came back, she knew that I had an interest in the history. So she would often invite me to participate in Jim Henson Legacy things. And then over time, she invited me to join the board of trustees of the Jim Henson Legacy. And I eventually left the Henson Company, but I stayed involved with the Jim Henson Legacy, which Jane founded. And it turned out that she had originally the Jim Henson Legacy was founded when Jim passed away, and it was an organization to respond to all of the outpouring of love and respect that was happening. And it was an organization that could, if someone wanted to name a school after Jim, this organization could work with Jane to craft a response. So eventually, after I left the company, I stayed involved with the Legacy. So I would end up, doing projects with Jane. I remember one time when I was still at the company, I did a project with Jim Lewis, who was one of the other staff writers, and Barbara Bush. This was during the first Bush administration, and Barbara Bush had a literacy project called Mrs. Bush's Storytime, and it was a radio show, and we did a couple of Muppet episodes of it, and Jim Lewis and I wrote the scripts, and we got invited to the White House. And so we went with Jane. They invited Jane and myself and Jim, and so we would, do a little bit of traveling, and she's just a very, very nice lady, and she always wanted Jim to get the credit. So even in the Jim Henson Legacy days, if the University of Maryland, where she went, as well as Jim, they wanted to honor her on occasion, and she would always say, well, make it about Jim, and I'll come and accept on his behalf. Wow. She was always a little uncomfortable, accepting praise on her own behalf.
Wow, that's wonderful. So obviously you kept in touch with her until she passed. I think she died, it'll be 10 years into 2023, I think. She died.
It's hard to believe, yeah.
Tell us about Jim's high school days and how he got into television via not the NBC station in Washington, but the CBS one.
Jim wanted to work in television. He was not a puppet guy, per se, but he really wanted to work in television. And the first opportunity was when a CBS owned station in D.C., it was then WTOP, they wanted to do a kids version of the network morning show that was at that point done with Walter Cronkite and Bill Baird doing puppets. And they said, well, we'll do that with kids. There's a new law that makes that legal now. There's a law that allows children to perform. So that was the plan. They put listings in the newspaper looking for a young puppeteer, and I think they came to Jim's puppet club in high school, where he was not a puppeteer, but he built sets. And Jim got it in his head that this is an opportunity to work in television. So he got books out of the library, and he built himself some puppets. And he and a friend, Russell Wall, did the audition, and they got picked. But and they did a couple of these shows. After 3 weeks, WTOP found out that the law that they were relying on actually only applied to theatrical productions and not television productions. So they were shut down after 3 weeks, but they really liked what Jim was doing, so they recommended, one of the people over at WTOP recommended Jim to WRC, the NBC station.
Now, was one of Jim's creation for WTOP the Pierre?
Yeah, Pierre the French Rat, which was Jim had done a comic strip of Pierre in high school, and that was sort of a puppet version of that, and it was a very old-fashioned puppet, very hard. It was like a hard material as opposed to the soft ones like Kermit that Jim did later on.
And it was hard because, correct me if I'm wrong, again, based on the research from reading your book, theater stage puppets were hard, made out of wood and hard plastic, because that's the way they worked with the strings and everything on the stage, right?
Yeah, both strings and hand puppets, but since they were far away, the audience was sitting far away from them, they didn't have to really do a lot of subtle close-up moves. So I think out of durability, because when you're doing theater puppetry, you're doing a lot of knockabout stuff and Punch and Judy and that sort of thing. You build them for durability, not necessarily flexibility.
Right, and it's so important in television, as we'll talk about in a second, that puppets have expressions and faces. And I think Jim was the first, if not early on, one of the first to use foam and fabric as opposed to wood and plastic, right?
Yeah, and I think it was, Jim was certainly among the first. I think Shari Lewis was also doing some of the stuff, but
Bob Clampett, Time for Beanie. I think Cecil was made out of a sock. So there were a few, but not a lot. I mean, you think of Howdy Doody, and you think of the type of puppets that were on the stage, right? Yeah.
Because generally speaking, the puppeteers that were doing early television, the Rufus and Margot Rose who were doing Howdy Doody, and a lot of the other puppeteers that worked in early television had come to it from working in puppet theater, and Jim had never worked in puppet theater.
Right. Now,
So
this was still pre-Jane, right? He hadn't met Jane until after, right? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to get that on record because he ended up taking more puppet classes after he started working at WRC, right?
Yeah. It was he started working at WRC because WTOP was his senior year in high school, and he graduated, and then in the fall he started at University of Maryland, and it was there that he met Jane, and I think it may be the only puppetry class at University of Maryland, but it was a required class for art education majors.
Okay, got it.
And that's why Jane was there.
All right, we've got so much to cover in so little time. Let's talk about some of the stuff that Jim did at WRC before the Salmon Friends came about, and then how it came about.
Jim basically was doing all sorts of stuff at WRC. He worked in the scene shop. They had, as all of these shows, all these stations in the 50s had, there was a Western-themed kids show, the Circle 4 Ranch. So Jim was doing puppets for the Circle 4 Ranch. That was, I think they called them Longhorn and Shorthorn. He started doing just little spots all around the schedule, and then they did a show called Afternoon, and that's when Jane came to work with Jim, because they met in the puppetry class, and Jim realized that when they were doing the afternoon show, which was a combination of home stuff, there were recipes, there was music, there was a weather report, and it was Willard Scott was on it as one of the people involved, and Jim figured that he needed someone to work with. His first partner, Russell Wall, had graduated high school and gone off someplace. So Jim knew Jane Nebel from puppetry class and liked what she was doing in puppetry class, and invited Jane to work with him on Afternoon. And it was the afternoon segments which attracted the attention of other people at WRC, and then they decided to give Jim and Jane their own show, the Salmon Friends, and they continued doing Afternoon and other things on the station. Right.
So that wasn't just the two. When Salmon Friends went on, was it 2 5-minute shows per day, or was it just one at the time?
I think they started with one.
Right, and the success, and that was the one that was on at 6:40 p.m. after the news.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if the first one was that or the 11:25, but it it was always either in that news block in the early afternoon or right before the Tonight Show, and sometimes it was both.
And that was the Tonight Show with Steve Allen, which is
Right,
important.
right.
Yeah.
And in this book, there's a whole chronology of all of the different time slots because
Right.
I went through and found news TV listings. And even though what was funny is that this was a 5-minute show, but it was even that 5-minute show was listed in the TV listings.
And they actually gave a description of it, or did it just say
No,
Sam and Friends?
Sometimes all it said was Sam.
Sam, not the Friends. The Friends did not get credit depending on the space. Okay.
Sometimes it said Muppets.
Okay. Let's talk about how Muppets became Muppets and not puppets. How did that happen?
It happened early on. Jim basically needed a name for his act, just like Bert Tillstrom had the Kuklapolitan Players. And he decided that Muppets sounded good. For several years in the 70s, primarily, maybe in the 60s, if he was asked, Jim would sometimes say it was a combination of marionette and puppet.
Aha!
That's how you got Muppet.
Yeah.
But he basically said that because he didn't have a real good answer where the name came from. It was just a name he made up.
Well, that's good, though. That's good.
And then he had
it's better than Parionette.
He retracted it years later when he realized, well, I don't want people, because I wasn't doing a lot of marionette stuff, so I didn't, don't want people to think that it had anything to do with that. But once you make up a story like that, it sort of becomes accepted. So it was harder to unring that bell, so to speak.
Right. Now, let's get one thing on record here. I guess when Jim was doing the afternoon show and anything else they had him do, the characters never spoke. They always lip-synced, and that's what Sam and Friends was. You mentioned Dr. Demento and the novelty records. They would go to the music library at WRC and pick out records, and that's what the Muppets did. They lip-synced and acted to pre-recorded records, and they did that on the afternoon show too, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
and the reason they did that is because that was what Bill Baird had been doing on that morning show.
Okay.
So
it was not an original idea. Out here, the puppets that we had out here, they spoke, but people like Soupy Sales, when Pookie came on, he would talk, but he would also lip sync to records. The point is, this was accepted back then that puppets did this, but let's establish the fact that at 6:40 and at 11:25, when they did go to twice a day, all Jim did was stage live puppet performances to records, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And it was a major
combination
hit.
of stuff.
Yeah, so much so that SK, and tell us, SK is the sponsor of the show. SK sponsored them throughout the entire run because they loved what they did, right?
Yeah, SK started around 1958 sponsorship.
Oh, so who sponsored them before? Or
I don't know if they had a sponsor.
They were
per se.
sustained?
They
Wow.
were sustaining, I believe, because it's such a small, short show.
Yeah.
So I think that there were spots.
Okay, and SK was a meat seller, right? Wholesale meat and retail meat.
It went back to the late 1800s. It was Schluterberg and Kirtle, S&K, and that's where SK.
It's a lot easier to say that.
Yes,
they sold a hell of a lot of meat though because of Jim Henson, right?
Oh yeah, they did very well, and they sponsored from 58 to the end of the run.
Now, when did Jim start having the characters talk? Was it the separate deal that he had to make filmed commercials for local sponsors?
That had a lot to do with it. I think that they.
Well, let's talk about that and how that came about. Did that come about as a result of the afternoon show?
It was Sam and Friends had already started, and Jim had was starting to get some appearances on network programs. Like Steve Allen and I think Will Rogers Jr. And the head of the Wilkins Coffee Company, John Wilkins, said in a newspaper article that he had seen the Muppets on that on one of the network appearances. I think he was aware of them doing the Sam and Friends, and he and his advertising people thought they could do a good job selling coffee. And they had just introduced a new kind of commercial spot with this ID tag, station identification tag. Stations were mandated to identify themselves every hour, but and they were supposed to set aside 10 seconds for the announcement, but it doesn't take a full 10 seconds to say WRC-TV, Washington. So they could sell some of that time, and they would essentially sell like 7 or 8 seconds of that time as a commercial and do the station ID as part of that for 3 seconds. And those were the spots that Jim was hired to make for Wilkins, and they became very successful. And that is one of the earliest instances of Jim using his voice, and it coincides with a period of time when the station had paired Jim with a guy named Paul Arnold, who was a folk singer. And I think that they figured this is a guy who could do some voices for the Muppets, and he could do commercials. So the show, Sam and Friends, became Footlight Theater, and then it became Sam and Friends with Paul Arnold. But Paul Arnold never really added that much to the show. And once Jim started doing these commercials and could prove that he could do voices for his characters, they started adding some of Jim's voices to the show when Paul Arnold was still doing it. And then that eventually led to Paul Arnold left the station. We don't know if it was because of that, but he left the station at some point. And they realized that Jim could do the voices and could do the commercials and, speak for the Muppets.
And this is how he lent voice to Sam. Sam was really the only...
Well, Sam actually never talked.
Oh, Sam didn't talk? Because Sam was the only character on the show that you could actually tell was something. Sam was a bald-headed man, right?
Yep.
But everybody else, Kermit was not a frog when he started. All the other characters were so generic. We're running out of time, and there's so much to talk about here. Let's talk about how Kermit started, and Kermit was one of the first characters to actually have a voice, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So now I read in the book that Jim didn't deny that Kermit was some kind of amphibian in the early. If you see some of the early shots, he's sort of amphibious, if that's a word.
Yep.
But he's not really a frog. But you said that Kermit was made out of an old coat and a ping pong ball.
Yes. Jim's mom had a coat that was sort of a milky turquoise. Jim always wanted to tell people that the first Kermit was not the bright green that we know today. He didn't want people to think that his mom was going around in the bright green coat. But there was an old turquoise coat that was in the Henson family rag bag, as it were. And Jim found it and cut a ping pong ball in half. And at the Smithsonian, what's great, you can see it used to be hidden when the puppet was displayed. The sleeve that goes up into Kermit's torso was made from a pants leg of a pair of Jim's jeans. So, so it's all found objects. I think that the inside of the mouth was made out of shoe leather, and and there's nothing in that head except for Jim's hand. So it's incredibly flexible.
Yeah, and then like Paul Winchell, around the same time, Jim was one of the first to give the puppets arms. And I think Jane helped with that when Jim's two hands, one in the head, one in the left arm, Jane was the right arm on some of these? Is that...
On some of them, yeah. And I think that they were doing that, and then some of the characters, had gloves for that reason, so the hand difference was not that pronounced. And also, Bob Payne was a third member of the team that came in around 1958.
Yeah, yeah. We've got a couple of minutes left, and there's so much to talk about. I think what I want to do is talk about the technique in doing these shows on the air. Now, when they filmed the commercials, they didn't film them at a TV studio. They were at, I think it was Rodell. Is that what the name of them?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a film studio, and they had to use mirrors because they're underneath, and they had to be able to see what they were doing on top. So they had mirrors aimed up so that when these commercials were filmed, they had a mirror image. It was backwards, but they could see what they were doing, right?
Yeah, in the beginning, that's what they did for the Wilkins commercials. They had a big, long mirror, but they realized they had become very reliant on the monitor. So fairly early on, they were able to bring in a TV camera into Rodell. I guess they had first started getting some portable television equipment. So they brought in a camera and a monitor that they would put on directly next to the film camera, and they would try and line up the frame as closely as possible.
And you made a brilliant observation in the book, and you did this for me. I know you did this for me, even though I hadn't even met you or knew about this, is you compared it to the Electronicam system that Gleason used for the classic 39 Honeymooners. They shot those on 35 millimeter film, but they put TV cameras next to each of the film cameras, and they made a kinescope, which I didn't know. I thought it was just being fed into the control room, but they made a kinescope where the television director cut from between those cameras, so they had a kinescope film to look at when they assembled the film. And this is what Jim did. Right.
Yep.
And on TV,
and the only difference is that while Electronicam was done so the director could direct it, Jim's version of it was done so they could perform to the framing that they were used to doing in the television studio. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you, this thing was an enormous success. Millions of viewers in the Washington, D.C. area watched this thing daily. SK sponsored it, and then all of a sudden in 1961, they decided they weren't going to sponsor it anymore. Did their sales drop? Why did the show end?
I'm not sure. That's the one thing. There were certainly in the files there were the letters from SK saying it was a great experience. They all loved Jim and Jane, and they were talking about how sad the decision was. And I think part of it is that they wanted to, this sponsorship was confined to when Sam and Friends aired. And then later on, what had happened after the Sam and Friends ended, they continued to hire Jim to do commercials for SK, but they would air them as spot commercials all over the schedule.
Oh my!
So I think then they were doing SK commercials into the early 60s, and like 62, 63. Oh. And it was so like Rolf was even in an early SK commercial.
Oh my goodness! Yeah,
it was. I think it may have been a combination of just it wanting to reach other audiences, and all of television started to shift into spot commercials opposed to sponsorships.
Absolutely.
So they certainly still loved Jim and Jane and continued to work with them.
Yeah. Well, that's good that it wasn't it was an amicable split. And as we talked about the other day, and I think you mentioned in the book, Jim was ready to move on because he started, like you said earlier in our segment here, he started to do more national television. The Today Show, the Tonight Show, he was moving. In fact, as soon as Sam and Friends ended, they hightailed it to New York, and they pretty much did Sam and Friends every day on the Today Show. They had their own isolated segments, right?
It was, I think, on a weekly basis at least, sometimes more frequently.
And one of the things I do want to mention is even when they started doing their own talking, when Jim was lending voice to this, as you saw with the Huntley and Brinkley thing, lots of editing, and everything was recorded in advance so they could play it from the control room, and they could talk and move about the studio when it was being played back without anybody hearing them, right? It just made it for a smoother show.
Yeah, even when Jim started doing the voices for the characters, they still pre-recorded
everything was on acetate and was played back from the control room.
And then as years went on, when they started doing Sesame Street and The Muppet Show, it really shifted. And even before that, the variety appearances, it shifted to dialogue was done live on the studio floor, and music would be recorded and played back.
Right, like Mana Mana, which went around and around in my head back then because my sister is about your age and she had Sesame Street on the Mana Mana. It was always that. How did Jim create Rolf the dog for the Jimmy Dean Show?
He actually created Rolf the dog for a Purina commercial.
Oh.
In Canada. And Rolf had a partner, Baskerville. Baskerville was a dog, the hound of the Baskervilles. So Baskerville and Rolf had a double act, essentially, doing Purina commercials in Canada. And then when the Jimmy Dean show came around, they decided that Rolf could be a good hound dog buddy for Jimmy Dean.
Uh-huh.
So Jim did the head and the left hand. And Frank Oz, who was kind enough to write the foreword for my book, he did the right hand. That was one of his first jobs working for Jim. When
there you go. That's in the book, the whole story of how Jim hooked up with Frank Oz, which we will cover when you're back on one of my regular shows next year. That was my first introduction to the Muppets, was the Jimmy Dean show in the summer when I could stay up late and watch it because it was on at 10 o'clock. I always look forward to Rolf. And that was pretty much everybody outside of Washington and New York's introduction to the Muppets that didn't see them on the Today Show, right? Was Rolf. Right.
Yeah, pretty much. If they hadn't seen the Muppets on commercials, because Jim was doing those commercials that he had done in Washington, he would redo them for different products across the country, different markets. So some people got to see those commercials, but if in terms of a regular spot, the Jimmy Dean show was the first exposure for many fans.
As you know, I'm a big fan of classic TV, and it's just as good a book as The History of the Muppets as it is a really great glimpse of what went on in local TV back in the 50s. It's really, you really outdid yourself with research, my friend. I haven't seen your encyclopedia of Muppet characters, but you've got your own encyclopedia of every character that's on Sam and Friends in this as well. So you know, and the book is doing really well. The Muppet fans are just loving you, right?
I've been hearing really good things about the book. And what's nice is that the Henson family has been very appreciative. I got a very nice email from Lisa Henson, who read the book and really, really enjoyed it.
All right.
And I've been seeing a lot of Henson fans at the events. I host screenings at the Museum of the Moving Image, and a lot of people have been coming out and telling me great things about the book. And it makes me feel really good because I feel like this is an opportunity to tell a great part of Jim's story. And like you said, it's also, I love stories of early television. Oh. And I think that there's a lot in here, even if you don't know anything about Jim Henson or the Muppets. There's a lot of good stuff. And Brian J. Jones wrote a great biography of Jim Henson, but had to cover an entire career. So there's a lot of stuff that he dug up about Sam and Friends. He shared all of his research with me. And there's a lot of stuff he dug up about it, but he couldn't put into his book because he had to cover a whole lifetime. Right. I'm only covering essentially 1955 to 1961. So I'm able to go into much more detail and share it with the audience, and I really love that.
Oh, and I loved it, too. There's a whole section in there about how WRC was converted to color in the late 50s, I think 58, and as a result, Sam and Friends had to go in color, and that just drove Jim crazy because he built those puppets for black and white. And
he really liked working in black and white, you know.
Yeah. It's all in the book, and it's wonderful. You did a fabulous job, and you are going to come back in 2023, and we'll do this again, right?
I would be delighted anytime.
All right. Thank you, Craig. Thanks for giving up part of your New Year's.
New Year's Eve with Stu and Janine is a Showcase video production. Paula from MikeMonster.com speaking. Happy New Year, everybody.